Microsoft just made a quiet move that changes everything. They stopped treating your Microsoft 365 tenant as a storage system and started treating it as a reasoning system. It is no longer a place where you go to search for files. It is now a system that understands what those files actually mean. The difference isn't small. This shift restructures your governance, it exposes your culture, and it forces your organization to confront decision-making in ways you have been avoiding for years. We call this work IQ. Most leaders do not realize this is already happening. But this episode diagnoses exactly what is breaking and why the old model cannot survive what comes next. The productivity measurement crisis. Your organization is busy. That is not the problem. The problem is that you have no idea whether being busy actually means being intelligent. Think about what you actually measure right now. You look at email volume, meeting hours, and task completion rates because those are the metrics on your dashboards and the numbers your executives see. But those numbers have almost nothing to do with whether your organization is getting smarter or dumber. They measure activity. They do not measure value. This gap between being busy and being effective has become structural. It is baked into how most companies operate today. You can have a person sitting in back-to-back meetings all day, responding to emails at 11 p.m. and closing every task on time, while your critical decisions are still getting made slower than ever. Context gets lost every time someone switches between Outlook and Teams end up solving the same problem 5 different times because nobody knows a solution already exists 3 floors down. Here is the brutal fact. 95% of enterprises see little to no measurable impact from AI right now. This is not because the AI is bad, but because leaders are still using activity metrics to measure intelligence. They deployed a copilot that costs money to run, they trained people to use it, and then they measured success by how many people opened the app. They did not measure whether decisions got made faster, or if rework went down, or if people finally stopped searching for information because the system understood what they needed before they even asked. Work IQ forces a reckoning with this broken system because Work IQ does not hide. It makes what is actually happening visible. When Work IQ starts reasoning over your emails, your meetings, and your files, it builds a semantic model of how your organization actually works. Not how you say it works, but how it actually works. The moment an AI system understands which documents matter and who is talking to whom, it becomes impossible to hide a broken operating model behind a dashboard of activity metrics. The real cost to your business is not the time people spend working. Time is infinite in a sense because people will always generate more of it. The real cost is context switching and decision friction. Value dies every time someone has to stop what they are doing to search for information they should already have, or when a decision gets delayed because the right people lack the right context. Institutional knowledge gets locked in a single person's email instead of being available to the system, and that friction is where your progress stops. Work IQ targets that friction directly. It does not just speed up your email or make your meetings shorter. It builds a persistent, permission-aware understanding of what matters and who needs to know it. That is a completely different category of capability than just making people faster at the tasks they already do. But here's what most organizations miss. You cannot just plug Work IQ into a broken system and expect it to fix things. In reality, it does the opposite. It exposes every single weakness you have. It shows you exactly where context is being lost and exactly where your decisions are bottlenecked. It reveals where people have access to information they should never see and where they are blocked from seeing the information they actually need to do their jobs. That visibility is uncomfortable. Once you see the problem, you cannot unsee it, and that means you have to fix it. You have to redesign how decisions happen and change what you measure. You have to align your governance structures with how work actually flows instead of how the org chart says it should flow. That is what this shift is really about. It is not about faster productivity. It is about organizational intelligence finally becoming visible. And organizations usually hate visibility into their own dysfunction. How Microsoft 365 was built. To understand why Work IQ had to exist, you first need to look at how Microsoft 365 was actually built. It was never designed to be a reasoning system. Instead, the creators built a collection of specialized tools where each one solved a single specific problem. Outlook handles your email, Teams manages your chats, and SharePoint takes care of document storage. Because each tool has its own data model and its own permissions logic, they stay siloed by design. They are connected at the surface, but they are not integrated at the intelligence level. Microsoft recognized this liability early on, so they built Microsoft Graph to unify the data access layer. Graph is a massive technical achievement because it simplified how applications talk to your data. Before Graph existed, if you wanted to build an app that touched your calendar and your files, you had to manage several different authentication flows and stitch together different data models. Graph changed that by providing one API and one permission framework for everything. But here is the problem that Graph didn't solve. It never unified the reasoning layer. Graph is excellent at answering one specific question: what data exists and who is allowed to see it? It returns objects like files, messages, and meetings. You can ask Graph to show you every file shared with a specific user or find every email from last year about a certain project. Graph will find them and respect your permissions, but it won't tell you why those files actually matter. The system doesn't understand how these pieces relate to each other in the real world. It won't realize that 3 different emails are describing the same problem from 3 different angles. It won't know that the solution is actually buried in a SharePoint document that nobody thought to search for because it wasn't tagged correctly. You can retrieve information from Microsoft 365, but the system has no idea why that information is important to your team. This architecture is the reason organizations became data-rich but intelligence poor. You can dump every meeting transcript and document into the system, and you can index it all for search. But the system itself has no memory and no understanding of patterns. Every time a user interacts with it, the process starts from zero. Every search is independent, and every application has to rebuild context from scratch because Graph simply wasn't built to do that work for you. The original design reflected an old assumption that people always know exactly what they are looking for. If you need an email, you search for it, and if you need to schedule a meeting, you open your calendar. The system was just a digital filing cabinet. Its only job was to store and retrieve, while your job was to know what you needed and ask for it. That logic made sense back in 2016, but it doesn't work anymore. Work has become too fragmented for that model to hold up. Information lives in too many places, and making a good decision now requires connecting signals from email, meetings, and collaboration patterns. Right now, the system just hands you the raw material and expects you to do all the reasoning yourself. It tells you to figure it out. And that is exactly where the model breaks. The Graph backbone. Microsoft Graph is the actual infrastructure that runs through the entire suite. It isn't just a marketing term, it is the data spine for every user, file, and email in your organization. Graph exposes all of that data and enforces the permissions on it. It is the backbone that holds the entire ecosystem together. Graph is very good at answering who can access what. When you tell Graph to get a user's emails from the last month, it finds them quickly and checks the permissions. It is fast and consistent, which is why developers can build apps that touch multiple services without rewriting the security logic a dozen times. It provides a solid foundation for data access, but that is where its capabilities end. The big issue is that Graph is completely stateless. Every single query you send starts from a blank slate. Graph doesn't remember what you asked a minute ago, and it has no idea what you were working on yesterday. It won't connect an email to a document and a meeting to say they are all part of the same project. Graph returns exactly what you ask for, but it never infers what you actually need to get your job done. If a developer wants to build an app on top of Graph, they have to do all the heavy lifting themselves. To build a tool that summarizes a project, you have to call the API 5 different times to get the emails, meetings, and people involved. Then you have to write custom code to connect those dots. You have to teach the app which documents were discussed in which meetings, because Graph just hands you raw data and walks away. Because there is no shared understanding, every application ends up rebuilding context separately. Your calendar tool, your email client, and your project manager are all trying to figure out the same thing in isolation. There is no organizational memory. There is no persistent model that understands how signals from different systems actually connect to each other. This is how you end up with perfect data access but zero organizational intelligence. Graph handles the first problem of access beautifully, but it doesn't solve the second problem of meaning. It gives you the what, but never the why. Think about how this feels for you as a user. When you are in a meeting and need to understand the history of a project, you have to manually search through old notes and scroll through endless email threads. You are the one piecing the story together because the system doesn't maintain a model of what was decided or what comes next. It doesn't remember that you care about this specific project, and it doesn't connect today's conversation to a decision made last week. Graph is a powerful foundation, but having power over data is not the same as having intelligence about work. Graph gives you the access you need to find files. Work IQ gives you the understanding you need to actually finish the job. Enter Work IQ. Microsoft didn't solve the Graph problem by replacing it, but by building something entirely new on top of it. Work IQ sits directly on that Graph backbone and adds the one thing Graph was always missing. It uses 3 distinct layers to turn your raw data into actual organizational understanding. The first layer is all about the data itself. Work IQ takes permission-aware access to everything Graph sees, including your emails, meetings, files, and even the subtle collaboration signals between teams. It feeds all of this into a semantic engine that never stops learning. This isn't just a basic index of your files, it's an active analysis that builds associations and learns what matters by watching how people actually interact with information every day. Then we move into the context layer, which is where the real reasoning happens. Work IQ develops a deep understanding of relationships that goes far beyond simple connections. It doesn't just see that person A emailed person B. Instead, it understands that both people are collaborating on Project Gamma and have been debating risk mitigation for weeks. It knows there are 3 open decisions waiting on the finance team. It understands your projects, your workflows, and your priorities. It sees how decisions flow and where information gets stuck. This builds a model of your company that makes the official org chart look like a toy. An org chart tells you who reports to whom, but it can't tell you who actually drives the decisions or who sits at the center of the most critical information flows. The third layer is the memory layer, and this is the part Graph could never do on its own. WorkIQ maintains a persistent and evolving understanding of how every person and team actually gets things done. It remembers your typical collaborators and the projects you usually touch. It learns your communication style and how you prefer to make decisions. It knows what information you need and exactly when you usually need it. This isn't just for one session. It remembers across weeks and months to build a behavioral profile of your work. The goal isn't surveillance, but rather understanding you well enough to help. When an agent tries to assist you, it can make a smart guess about what you need instead of a stupid guess based on a keyword search. This combination creates a work graph, which is fundamentally different from the entity graph you get with standard tools. It is a living, breathing model of how your organization functions in the real world. It tracks who works with whom, why a specific task matters, and what needs to happen next. It maps the bottlenecks and the decision flows that actually run the business. This shift is crucial for anyone building applications at scale, especially with Copilot. Because WorkIQ has already done the heavy lifting, the system now has memory and context. Copilot doesn't have to start from zero every time you ask a question. It doesn't need to be retrained on your specific world every single morning. WorkIQ has already built that persistent model of what matters. It knows your pending decisions and what you've tried in the past. It even knows why similar problems weren't solved years ago. This is the real reason Copilot works at scale. It isn't just that the large language model got smarter. It's because the intelligence layer underneath it became persistent and contextual. Copilot isn't just looking at raw text anymore. It is reasoning over an organizational understanding that WorkIQ has already synthesized into something useful. The power here comes from the fact that WorkIQ learns from you. It improves over time and gets better at predicting what you'll need next. It connects scattered signals into a coherent picture and routes information to the right people before they even ask for it. The system isn't static. It is constantly refining its own model of how work actually happens in your office. Moving from simple data retrieval to persistent reasoning changes everything. It changes what is possible, what is required, and what is at risk. When you have an intelligence layer that understands your company better than your executives do, governance becomes a massive priority. This system sees patterns that nobody has the time to track manually. Your risks become visible, and your organizational flaws are suddenly exposed for everyone to see. The aggregation problem. We need to talk about what happens when you concentrate all that intelligence in one single place. That is exactly what WorkIQ does. It doesn't just build understanding. It consolidates every signal your company produces. It pulls from Outlook, Teams, SharePoint, and your OneDrive. It looks at your directory and every collaboration pattern it can measure. It ingests and synthesizes all of it into one continuous model of your organization. That concentration of data is incredibly powerful, but it also creates a massive problem. WorkIQ creates a high-value target because it aggregates everything. Before this, your risks were distributed across different silos. Your email lived in one place while your documents lived in another. Your conversations and your relationships were all separated. If permissions were broken in one system, it was a contained problem. Now imagine an AI agent that understands all of those systems at the same time. This agent can instantly see every relationship, every document, and every thread of context that exists anywhere in your company. If your permission model is weak, WorkIQ won't hide it. It will expose that weakness to your agents immediately. An agent can now discover exactly which sensitive documents a user technically has access to, even if they shouldn't. It doesn't matter if it's a legacy permission from 5 years ago that nobody cleaned up. The semantic layer in WorkIQ will find the connection. It will realize the document relates to the user's current task and surface it. That isn't a helpful feature. It's a liability waiting to explode. Think about the oversharing problem in SharePoint. In most companies, oversharing isn't seen as a governance failure, but as a normal way of working. Someone creates a site and shares it with everyone just to make things easy. Years go by and that site becomes part of the institutional memory. Nobody audits the access or revisits the policy because leaving it open is easier than managing it. In the old world, this was just a boring compliance issue for the auditors to flag. With WorkIQ, that oversharing becomes an operational nightmare. An agent can instantly discover that sensitive financial plans are accessible to half the company because of one lazy decision made 3 years ago. The agent might not intentionally leak the info, but the fact that it can see the data means your risk is now visible and measurable. It becomes impossible to ignore. This is the point where most organizations start to panic. The moment WorkIQ starts looking at your tenant, it reveals what is actually in there. It doesn't care what you think is in there. It finds the dark matter. It finds the stale SharePoint sites and the orphan Teams groups that nobody remembered to archive. It sees the broken permission inheritance and the files sitting in personal folders that should be in a governed space. It even sees the confidential email threads that were forwarded to the wrong people. All of that dark matter exists in every real organization, and it all becomes visible to WorkIQ. The system doesn't see these as compliance violations, but as operational reality. It's just another factor the system has to account for when it tries to help you. The AI can't ignore it, and it can't pretend the data isn't there. You can no longer hide your data hygiene problems. Not from WorkIQ, and certainly not from the agents that use it. The visibility is now complete, and when everything is visible, you are forced to make a choice. You either fix the underlying problem or you choose to accept the risk. You can't pretend the danger doesn't exist anymore. This is exactly why governance has to happen before you ever hit the deploy button. The permission model. Microsoft made a very specific design choice here that changes everything. WorkIQ does not introduce a brand new security model, and it doesn't try to build a separate framework for access control. It never bypasses the existing permission structures you already have inside Microsoft 365. Instead, the system operates entirely within those established boundaries. Every agent you build and every query a user makes runs through the same identity layers that protect your email, your files, and your Teams chats. On the surface, this sounds incredibly reassuring, and for the most part, it is. There is no new data exposure to worry about because WorkIQ cannot let an agent see something a human user couldn't already open. If you lack the permissions to read a specific file in SharePoint, WorkIQ simply won't show that file to the agent. When you aren't a member of a specific Teams channel, the agent is unable to pull conversations from it. If you don't have access to a specific thread in Outlook, WorkIQ won't include that data when it tries to synthesize context. The permission boundary is absolute, but this is exactly where governance starts to get complicated. There is a massive gap between what a person can access and what they actually should access. You have to look at the difference between what the technical system allows and what the organization actually intends for its employees to see. In almost every organization, access permissions tend to get broader as time goes on. A sensitive file gets shared with everyone in finance just because it was convenient at the moment. A SharePoint site ends up with wide open access because it was easier to share the whole folder than to manage individual permissions. Teams channels often include people from 5 different departments because they collaborated once, and removing them later feels socially awkward. The permission model usually reflects historical convenience rather than current business intent. WorkIQ is going to expose this gap immediately. Instead of a human manually hunting for sensitive documents, which is a slow and incomplete process, an AI agent can reason across everything a user is technically allowed to touch. An agent can instantly tell a user that they have access to strategic planning documents, budget forecasts, and executive communications about an upcoming acquisition. The agent isn't actually breaking any rules or violating permissions. It is simply making the invisible visible by showing what the permission model already allows. In most companies, the permission model allows for things that nobody ever intended to make public. This reality makes sensitivity labels and DLP policies your most critical infrastructure. WorkIQ respects these labels in real time, which means a document marked highly confidential does more than just restrict external sharing. It actually restricts what the AI agent is allowed to do with that information. The agent cannot summarize that document, it cannot include it in morning briefings, and it cannot synthesize it with other files. The label acts as a digital gate for the AI just as much as it does for the human. This shift moves governance from a passive state to an active one. Traditionally, sensitivity labels were used for prevention, like stopping a document from being shared externally or blocked from being copied. The system would wait for a human to take an action and then reactively block it if it broke a rule. WorkIQ turns that model into a system of continuous enforcement. The label doesn't just block a final action, but it actively controls what the AI is allowed to think about. It dictates what the agents see and what gets included in a final summary. Because every request runs through a policy engine that understands context, the system doesn't just ask if a user has access. It asks if the specific request from that specific identity makes sense within the current context and company policy. This is real-time evaluation happening during every single query and every single inference. This level of granularity is necessary, but it is also brand new for most teams. Most organizations do not have governance frameworks that are sophisticated enough to work at this speed. They rely on broad, static policies where a specific role can do one thing and a security group can do another. That works fine when humans are clicking through folders manually. It fails completely when agents are making thousands of micro decisions every second. If your policy framework isn't precise, those micro decisions will eventually expose sensitive information. The permission model is secure by design, but that security is only as good as the labels you've applied. Your safety depends entirely on the quality of your policy design and how well you maintain those rules over time. If you get this right, WorkIQ actually becomes more secure than your current setup because it enforces policy with perfect consistency. If you get it wrong, you've created the exact problem you were trying to avoid by giving intelligent agents far too much room to roam. The data hygiene crisis. We have to talk about an uncomfortable reality that most leadership teams are currently ignoring. If you opened up your SharePoint environment right now to perform a real audit, you would probably hate what you found. You likely have sites that haven't been touched in 3 years and Teams groups created for projects that ended back in 2021. Files are sitting in personal OneDrive folders that should be in official repositories, but they stayed local because it was easier for the employee. Your naming conventions have probably changed several times, leaving your content inconsistent and confusing. This isn't just a compliance headache in the old-fashioned sense. It is a fundamental operational reality that every single organization deals with. Most companies just learn to live with the mess. The general attitude is that things are cluttered, but we manage to get our work done anyway. Audits might find a few issues that get fixed, but the rest of the data just continues to drift. It isn't a perfect system, but it works because people know how to navigate the chaos. They know where the important files actually live, even if the folder structure says they should be somewhere else. Work IQ changes that math entirely. An AI doesn't navigate a mess the same way a human does. It doesn't use common sense or apply human judgment to skip over old folders. It won't say that a file technically exists, but nobody would ever think to look for it. Instead, the AI sees that the file is discoverable and accessible, so it pulls it into the conversation. An agent powered by Work IQ can instantly catalog and surface every sensitive document a user has technical access to. It doesn't care what the organization intended for that user to see. It only cares what the broken permission model actually allows. This isn't a helpful feature, but rather a massive liability disguised as a productivity tool. Think about the actual consequences of this. You might have financial planning documents that were shared with a finance group 5 years ago, and nobody has checked that group's membership since. Work IQ will find them and surface them. You might have executive emails about sensitive strategic decisions that were forwarded to the wrong people years ago. Work IQ will find those too. Confidential HR documents might be sitting in a SharePoint site from a hiring decision that ended in 2019, but because the share was never removed, Work IQ will connect the dots. This is the moment where organizations realize that governance cannot be an afterthought. You cannot deploy Work IQ first and then try to clean up the mess later. You have to fix the foundation before the intelligence layer turns your digital clutter into a full-blown operational emergency. Microsoft calls this the Copilot ready data problem, and they are right to focus on it. But this isn't just about one specific tool. It is about the danger of deploying an intelligent agent that sees everything without the human context that makes a mess tolerable. Once an AI starts reasoning over your data, the dark matter in your files becomes an urgent priority. Stale sites become liabilities, orphaned groups become security risks, and broken permissions become impossible to ignore. Cleaning up your data is the absolute prerequisite for this technology. It isn't a follow-up project or something you can handle during phase 2 of your rollout. It is the gate you have to pass through. Before you let Work IQ loose, you have to get your SharePoint environment clean by archiving dead sites and fixing permission inheritance. You need to rationalize your team's structure so you actually know why each group exists and who is in it. You also need naming conventions that actually mean something to a machine. Your file structure should tell the system what the content is without requiring the AI to guess. You have to fix your sensitivity labels so they reflect actual business risk rather than theoretical categories. Finally, you need to look at your distribution lists to see who is actually receiving information and archive the ones that are no longer in use. None of this is exciting work. It isn't a new capability you can brag about in a meeting. It is basic digital housekeeping, but it is also essential. The second Work IQ starts looking at your data, every structural weakness you've tolerated for years will become visible. Every shortcut your team took in 2018 becomes a piece of operational debt that is now due. Every time you said, "we'll fix it later," you were creating a future governance crisis. You have to treat data cleanup as a requirement, not an option. You don't do this because a software vendor told you to. You do it because Work IQ will no longer allow you to pretend that the problem doesn't exist. From storage to reasoning. This is the actual pivot point. We aren't talking about a feature update or some incremental improvement, but a fundamental restructuring of what the system is actually for. The old model is simple. You store data, and then users come to the system to get it back. They usually know what they need, or at least they think they do, and they go through the motions of retrieval. You open an email client and search for a specific message. You go to SharePoint, navigate through folders, and download a file. You check your calendar to find a meeting and see the details. In this world, the system handles storage and retrieval while the human handles the reasoning. You are the one who decides what to search for, what to do with the results, and what the information actually means. You connect the dots because the system is neutral. It holds everything equally, never judging what matters or remembering what you cared about yesterday. And it certainly doesn't predict what you might need tomorrow. This model works fine if you are dealing with discrete artifacts like a single email or one document. But the reality is that knowledge work isn't discrete. It is continuous, relational, and layered. A project never lives in just one place. It lives across email threads, Teams conversations, SharePoint documents, meeting notes, and random chats with people across 3 different departments. To actually understand a project, you have to manually pull signals from every one of those locations and connect them yourself. You have to remember what you learned from each source and synthesize it into something coherent, because the system won't help you. It just gives you the raw material and leaves the hard work to you. Work IQ inverts this entire process. The new model is built to continuously reason over data, surface patterns, and anticipate what you need next. The system doesn't wait for you to ask a question because it is constantly analyzing, learning, and building associations. It updates its own model of what matters based on how you actually work rather than how you say you work. It looks at the patterns in your actions, like who you actually talk to and what you spend your time on. It identifies which decisions matter because they create follow-up activity and figures out what information actually affects your outcomes. Because of this, the role of information architecture shifts completely. It is no longer about organization, folder structures, or naming conventions. Those things become secondary. Architecture is now about intelligence and how the system is going to reason about your content. You have to ask what metadata matters for synthesis instead of just filing, and what relationships the system needs to understand. The goal is to help the system learn patterns and represent decisions so it can anticipate the next step in the process. This changes everything for your operations. WorkIQ doesn't just find documents, it understands why they matter in the context of what you are doing right now. It looks at the problems you are solving, the people involved, and the decisions that are still pending. It doesn't just say, here's a document labeled project status. Instead, it tells you that the document is a status update from 3 weeks ago regarding Project Gamma. It notes that 2 blocking decisions were resolved when finance signed the budget and legal cleared the contract, but one is still open. It identifies that the head of product and the head of sales disagree on the go-to-market timeline. Even if you aren't directly involved, the system knows your team is implementing features that depend on this, and you will be blocked in 2 weeks if it isn't fixed. That isn't retrieval, that is true understanding. The system tracks relationships at a level humans simply cannot maintain manually. It sees who works with whom, how decisions flow, and which people are central to specific outcomes. It identifies which teams have friction and which cross-functional relationships are breaking down. The system doesn't build this view from surveys or org charts, but from observable patterns in how work actually happens. It sees where information flows and where it gets stuck, distinguishing between real collaboration and ceremonial meetings. Since the system is reasoning continuously, it can answer the questions humans never bother to ask because the manual work would take hours. It can tell you what should happen next based on patterns, history, and what similar situations led to in the past. It knows who needs to be involved and what is typically required before the next phase can start. This is not just a small change, it restructures how an entire organization operates. The inference risk. Work IQ doesn't just consolidate the things you explicitly store, it infers. That distinction matters more than most organizations realize. Inference is fundamentally different from retrieval. When you search for a file, that file already exists and you are just finding it. But inference creates knowledge that was never actually documented. Work IQ analyzes patterns to generate conclusions about relationships and behaviors that nobody ever formally encoded. It observes how people interact with information, watches communication flows, and tracks decision sequences. From those observations, it infers structure. It finds influence networks, project dependencies, and decision bottlenecks. It figures out which people are central to outcomes and which teams hold authority that the official org chart doesn't show. This capability is incredibly valuable, but it is also dangerous if it's misused. Think about what an inference can become. Work IQ might observe that you are consistently involved in high-stakes decisions and that people reach out to you whenever things are uncertain. It sees that projects don't move forward until you give your input. That is an objective observation about your influence. And the system isn't making a judgment, it's just documenting a pattern. But the moment that inference becomes visible to management, things change. When someone points to the data and says you are a bottleneck, that inference transforms into a performance metric. What started as a descriptive observation becomes prescriptive pressure. Now, you are expected to move faster, stay out of certain decisions, and delegate more. The inference that described your actual role is suddenly weaponized as a measurement of your effectiveness. We see the same thing with behavioral patterns. Work IQ observes exactly when you work, noting that you spend all day in meetings but respond to emails at 10 p.m. It sees which conversations you join and which ones you just watch from the sidelines. It tracks how often you switch tools and how fast you respond to messages. All of this is inferable from data that already exists in your tenant, like email timestamps and calendar activity. The system isn't intentionally surveilling you, but the inferences that emerge can feel like judgment. It might conclude that a person overworks, responds slowly to feedback, or avoids difficult conversations. Even if the system is being entirely objective, those conclusions feel like surveillance. Here's the problem. Inference creates knowledge that didn't exist before. You never explicitly said you were a bottleneck or that you were overworking. The system inferred those truths by analyzing your behavior. Because this knowledge is derived from data rather than your own declarations, it is often more threatening. You can't really argue with it because you didn't create it or publish it. It just emerged from the system's analysis of how you actually behave every day. Organizations have to define boundaries on what inferences are actually permissible. This isn't about what is technically possible, but what is ethically and operationally appropriate for the culture. We have to ask if the system should be allowed to infer influence networks. The answer is probably yes, because that helps us understand how work gets coordinated. But should those inferences be visible to managers for performance reviews? Probably not, because that turns intelligence into a weapon. The system can technically infer that you work outside normal hours, but whether it flags that as a burnout risk or a sign of commitment depends entirely on the organization's values. Our privacy frameworks need to evolve much faster than the technology itself. Right now, most organizations don't have any governance structures that account for inference. They have plenty of policies about data collection, access, and retention, but they are silent on what kinds of patterns the system is allowed to derive. They haven't decided what counts as organizational intelligence and what counts as individual surveillance. Without those boundaries, the power of inference becomes a massive liability instead of an advantage. The memory problem. Work IQ doesn't just look for patterns in the moment, it remembers them. That is the critical distinction we need to understand. While inference describes what the system learns by looking at what you're doing right now, memory is what the system actually keeps. It's what the system carries forward to make decisions about the next hour, the next day, and the next month. This memory capability is incredibly valuable because Copilot shouldn't have to start from zero every single time you ask a question. It should know what you were working on last Tuesday, and it should remember the specific decisions your team made in that meeting. The system needs to understand that the problem you're wrestling with today is actually linked to a conversation you had 3 weeks ago with someone in a different department. By building a persistent model of how you work, the system learns who your typical collaborators are and which projects you actually own. It tracks the information you usually need, when you need it, and exactly how you prefer it to be presented. That behavioral memory is what makes Copilot feel like a partner instead of just a faster search engine. But here's the problem. Memory concentrates risk. What the system remembers is ultimately a governance question that most companies haven't answered yet. We have to ask how long this data stays, who can see it, and whether you can delete or correct it if the system gets it wrong. You might want to opt out of memory for certain sensitive activities, but right now the controls aren't always clear. Most organizations are currently flying blind on these questions. They have standard retention policies for email and documents, which are usually pretty straightforward. Email lives for 7 years and then it's gone, while documents follow the standard SharePoint rules. But memory about your behavioral patterns, your work preferences, and your decision history is entirely new territory. There is no established playbook for how long that data should be kept or what happens to it when an employee leaves the company. We don't know if that memory should transfer when you change roles or if it can be used to influence what the system shows to other people. Think about how this looks in practice. The system remembers that you are the person who always reviews financial decisions for certain projects, and it knows you prefer short executive summaries over long briefings. It sees that you typically pull in the same 3 people when a decision gets complicated, and it recognizes that your projects tend to be high risk and fast moving. All of that is true, and it helps Copilot serve you better, but what happens when you want to break that pattern? If you're burned out and want to stop being the bottleneck for every decision, the system's memory might actually trap you. It still thinks you're the person who needs to be involved, so it keeps pushing you into the same old loops. There is also the issue of what happens when someone leaves the organization. That person's communication style, their relationships, and their role in the hierarchy all stay behind in the work IQ memory. If the company later needs to figure out why a specific decision was made, the system can provide deep insights into how that departed person used to operate. While that might be great for institutional learning, it also creates a permanent surveillance archive of someone who isn't there to defend their record. Users need real visibility into what is being remembered about them. It isn't enough to know that memory exists. People need to see the specific patterns the system has documented and the conclusions it has drawn about their work habits. Users also need control, including the ability to edit or delete memory if it becomes inaccurate or if their circumstances change. Admins need these same controls over retention and decay. If the system forgets everything too quickly, Copilot won't be able to connect you with your own historical expertise when a problem resurfaces a year later. But if memory lasts forever, the system will continue to misrepresent you long after you've moved on to new ways of working. Memory governance is a brand new discipline, and until organizations build the right frameworks, work IQ cannot operate safely. Agent 365 and governed autonomy. This is the point where governance turns into organizational design. We have to stop thinking of agents as tools and start seeing them as actors. In the past, every tool you used in Microsoft 365 was passive. Outlook never sent an email unless you clicked send, and SharePoint didn't just decide to move your files around on its own. You were the one who initiated the action, which meant you were the one responsible for the outcome. The tool was just an instrument, and you held all the agency. Agents powered by work IQ change that dynamic because they can initiate, propose, and act without waiting for a human to tell them what to do. They operate autonomously within the boundaries you set, and the moment an agent takes an independent step, the question of accountability becomes urgent. If an agent makes a massive mistake, we need to know exactly who is responsible. Microsoft is addressing this through Agent 365. This isn't a new product you buy, but rather a governance framework that treats agents like real members of the organization. Agents get their own Entra ID accounts, their own licenses, and their own specific policies. You can assign them to roles, monitor their activity, and audit their decisions just like you would with a human employee. They aren't shadow ET or invisible scripts, they are managed and visible actors in your infrastructure. This approach is architecturally solid, but it creates a level of complexity that most companies aren't ready to handle. An agent working inside WorkIQ can act on your behalf by sending emails, updating CRM records, or posting in Teams. Because the agent inherits the permissions of the user it represents, it can't do anything you aren't allowed to do. That keeps things secure, but it isn't enough for true governance. You don't just need to know what an agent is allowed to do, you need to know what it should do. You have to decide which actions require a human to sign off and which decisions the agent can make on its own. Let's look at a real-world scenario. Imagine an agent is scanning your emails and documents and finds a contract that has been stuck in a review queue for 6 weeks. This is a major customer, and the delay is starting to cost the company money. The agent understands the context and realizes the delay was caused by a legal concern that was actually resolved in an old email thread. The agent could send a clarification to the legal team right now and unblock the entire deal. Should the agent send that email automatically, or should it wait for you to hit a button? Technically, there is no reason it couldn't just do it. You have permission to talk to legal, and the agent is acting for you. From a security perspective, it's fine, but from a governance perspective, it's a mess. We have to decide if that is helpful automation or if it's a dangerous precedent for agents to interfere in sensitive business matters. You need a clear organizational policy to answer these questions. This isn't a technical setting, it's a decision policy. You have to define which categories of work allow for full autonomy and which ones require the agent to stop and wait for approval. For high-risk decisions, the agent should probably stay in an advisory role rather than becoming an actor. This is an organizational design challenge because it forces you to clarify decision rights that are usually left unsaid. Most companies run on implicit understandings where Jane handles certain approvals and Tom manages resource allocation. That works fine when humans are using their judgment, but it breaks when you try to give an agent rules. Agents don't have judgment. They only have the rules you give them. And every rule has an edge case where it might be technically right, but organizationally wrong. Your governance structure has to be crystal clear before these agents start running. You need to know who approves what, how mistakes get fixed, and how to resolve a conflict when an agent's decision clashes with what a human wants. Without that clarity, Agent 365 becomes a liability. It's an autonomous system moving into areas where authority was never formally defined, making decisions that might seem logical to a machine but end up surprising the entire organization. And this is exactly where we find the connection to ROI. Why AI projects fail. This governance problem, the lack of clarity around agent autonomy and decision rights, isn't unique to WorkIQ. It's symptomatic of a much larger failure pattern that has been playing out across enterprise AI for years. WorkIQ doesn't solve that pattern. It exposes it. Here is the reality. 70 to 85% of enterprise AI projects fail to deliver their intended value. That isn't a failure of the technology, but rather a failure of organizational readiness. The AI works, the models are sophisticated, and the data is accessible. Yet, somewhere between deployment and the final outcome, the initiative stalls or gets abandoned. It produces results that simply don't match the promise. These failures cluster around a few recurring causes, and none of them are technical. The first is misaligned objectives. An organization decides to deploy AI and picks a use case that sounds promising, but the business stakeholders, the data team, and the technical teams never actually align on what success looks like. What problem are you solving? For whom? How will you measure it? Organizations often skip this conversation because they assume alignment exists when it doesn't. By the time they are 6 months in, it becomes clear the project is optimizing for the wrong outcome, and by then it's too late to redirect. The second cause is weak data. This isn't about having too little data, but about data quality and consistency. Many organizations have tons of data that no one really understands, which means they don't know where it came from, how it was collected, or if it's biased. You can build sophisticated AI on top of garbage data, but the result will just be sophisticated garbage. It will feel authoritative, but it will be wrong. The third issue is unclear ownership. When there is no named person responsible for the outcome, a project gets built by a team that eventually moves on. The system operates, but nobody is accountable for whether it's working, and nobody is incentivized to fix it when it breaks. Because nobody owns the relationship between the AI output and the business decision it supports, the tool becomes orphaned. The organization assumes it's working because nobody is complaining, but in reality, it's just being ignored. The fourth cause is structural. Organizations deploy AI, but don't redesign their workflows or change how decisions are made. They treat AI as a tool to accelerate the existing process instead of an opportunity to reimagine that process entirely. Copilot might write faster emails, but you're still writing the same number of emails. AI generates quicker summaries, but you're still sitting in the same number of meetings reading them. The tool got faster, but the organization didn't transform. Along with that, they measure adoption instead of outcomes. They track how many people use Copilot, how many prompts they send, or how many documents are processed. Adoption metrics are easy to measure, but outcome metrics are harder because they require baseline data and patience. It's easier to count users than to prove that decision speed increased or rework decreased. Consequently, organizations report adoption success while their actual outcomes stagnate. Work IQ amplifies this problem because it's powerful enough to expose it immediately. If you deploy Work IQ with unclear objectives, the system will generate outputs that contradict organizational assumptions within weeks. The objectives become obviously misaligned. If you deploy it with weak data, the system will confidently reason over bad information and produce plausible-sounding answers that are completely wrong. If you deploy it without clear ownership, there's no one responsible when the agent takes an action nobody expected. If you deploy it without workflow redesign, the system works fine, but adoption stalls because people don't know why they should change what they're doing. Work IQ doesn't hide these failures, it surfaces them. It accelerates the timeline to visibility, which is valuable, but only if the organization is ready to act on that visibility. Governance clarity must exist before deployment. This is where organizational intelligence becomes the real constraint. The management model problem. The management model in most organizations is built on an assumption that became obsolete decades ago. It's the idea that activity correlates with productivity, that hours worked predict output, and that meetings attended reflect engagement. Managers assume that if people look busy, they're being effective. Management by activity is easier than management by outcomes because activity is visible and simple to count. You count hours, you count meetings, and you count deliverables, so you don't have to think about whether any of it actually matters. Work IQ doesn't care about activity. It cares about outcomes. It observes what actually drives decisions and what actually moves projects forward to create value. What it observes in most organizations would be deeply uncomfortable to senior leadership if they had to articulate it clearly. The system can show you exactly who sits in meetings all day and never decides anything. You can see the calendar filled with 9 hours of back-to-back meetings, which looks productive and sounds exhausting. However, Work IQ can correlate that meeting load with actual decision output and closed items. Often the correlation is zero. The person in 9 hours of meetings generated no decisions, started no new initiatives, and closed nothing. The meetings created the illusion of productivity, and the activity created the appearance of contribution, but the outcome was nothing. Work IQ can surface who collaborates across teams extensively, but never drives closure. They are in the conversations, they are involved in the discussions, and they are included in the decisions, but the decisions don't actually happen until they leave the room. Outcomes don't move until someone else takes ownership. The collaboration is real, but the impact is a phantom. They are networked extensively, but central to nothing. Work IQ can also identify who has access to critical information but never uses it. These people are on distribution lists, they are invited to meetings, and they are added to the channels where decisions are documented, but they don't read the information, they don't act on it, and they don't integrate it into their work. The access is granted, but the consumption is absent. This pattern is visible in how they operate, as projects advance without their input because they were never actually paying attention. This visibility is operationally valuable and could drive real organizational transformation. Managers could see clearly where energy is wasted and where activity is mistaken for contribution. They could see where people are kept busy but not productive, and where structures create the appearance of collaboration without generating outcomes. But this visibility is also threatening to managers who depend on opacity. These are managers whose authority rests on controlling the flow of information and who benefit from ambiguous decision rights. They measure subordinates by activity because measuring by outcomes would expose that the work doesn't matter. They keep people in meetings because meetings look like management. Their own value proposition depends on decisions being hard to trace and outcomes being hard to measure. That's the reality Work IQ threatens to expose. In many organizations, management layers exist to manage opacity and translate activity into the appearance of progress. They protect people from having to answer the hardest question: what did you actually accomplish? Work IQ makes that question impossible to avoid. When the system shows clearly that your team generated 2 decisions in a month, while the adjacent team generated 12, you can't argue that they're equally productive. When the system demonstrates that half your meeting time is ceremonial and half is consequential, you can't argue for the current meeting culture. When the system maps decision flows and shows that critical decisions are made by 3 people while 30 others are kept in consultative loops, you can't argue that those loops matter. Organizations that build management systems around activity will resist Work IQ fiercely. They won't do it consciously. Publicly, they will say they welcome transparency, but operationally, the resistance will be real. Adoption will stall and the system will be tolerated but not genuinely used. Genuine use requires changing how managers themselves are evaluated. It requires holding them accountable for outcomes instead of activity and demanding clarity about what each person actually does. This is why adoption will be slower than Microsoft expects. The culture collision. Work IQ does more than just point out where individuals are struggling. It makes the invisible friction inside your company visible. It builds a map of exactly where things are breaking down. You see the communication gaps. You see the bottlenecks that kill your speed. You see the silos where information goes to die. It shows you teams that are working against each other simply because nobody actually knows what anyone else is doing. When leaders look at this map, They can finally point to the root cause. They can use real data to show that one division is operating like an island and that isolation is costing the company months of progress. They can see that a single decision is waiting on 5 different people who don't even realize they're all involved in the same process. They can see a project failing because it depends on data from another department that nobody is actually updating. The dysfunction isn't a feeling anymore. It's quantifiable, it's real, and it's undeniable. But here's the problem. Seeing the mess and actually being willing to clean it up are two very different things. Most organizations will fight against fixing the problems that WorkIQ reveals. It isn't because they don't see the value in a better system. It's because fixing the system means changing how power works. It means moving authority. It means tearing down the very silos that certain leaders have spent years building. Silos create domains and domains create fiefdoms. If you lead a silo, you have total authority over that space. If you break the silo, your authority disappears. Nobody wants to volunteer for that kind of demotion. The path of least resistance is to let WorkIQ find the flaws and then do absolutely nothing about them. It's easy to acknowledge the insight and just keep moving. Leaders will say they've known about the problem for years, but they'll claim a reorganization is too difficult to handle right now. Later never actually comes. The dysfunction stays visible, but the structures that created it stay exactly where they are. Some companies will take an even darker path. They won't use this visibility to improve the system. They'll use it to watch the people. They'll use WorkIQ to track who isn't hitting their numbers or who's spending too much time in meetings. They'll monitor who isn't collaborating enough or who's talking to the wrong people. The same data that could have redesigned the company gets turned into a weapon for surveillance. The system stops being a way to understand work and starts being a way to measure humans. This distinction is everything because it's what determines if your team trusts the system or hates it. If you use the data to fix broken workflows, people feel supported. They see the system as a tool that helps them understand their own process and work better. Trust goes up. But if you use it to judge individuals against hidden standards, people feel exposed. They realize the system is just a digital supervisor taking notes and building a case against them. The moment that feeling of surveillance kicks in, adoption is dead. People will find workarounds. They'll hide what they're doing. They'll start optimizing for the metrics they think you're watching instead of focusing on the work that actually matters. The system becomes the enemy. The technology itself doesn't care. The data is the same and the patterns are identical regardless of how you use them. The difference is entirely in your culture. Is this a tool for understanding how we work, or is it a tool for judging how well we work? Are we making the system visible so we can fix it, or making the people visible so we can rank them? Companies that have built real trust will use WorkIQ as an accelerator. They have the maturity to face what the data shows them and the flexibility to actually change their habits. But organizations that run on secrets and use busyness as a proxy for value will either resist this technology or corrupt it. They'll block it from being used or they'll turn it into a spy tool. Your culture is what decides if this intelligence layer becomes a way to transform your business or just another way to control your employees. And that is exactly where governance and ethics meet. The governance framework. This is the point where you move from just talking about the problem to building the actual infrastructure to manage it. None of the things we've talked about, agents working on their own, memory that lasts, or data being pulled together can happen safely without a solid governance framework. That framework has to cover 4 specific areas. The first area is data access. You have to decide which parts of your company WorkIQ is allowed to look at. Not every database or file system needs to be part of the intelligence layer. You need to make a deliberate choice about what's in and what's out. Your main Microsoft 365 environment is a yes. Your CRM is likely a yes. But your old archives or a developer's private sandbox, those should probably stay off limits. You aren't saying the system can never see them. You're deciding which systems you're comfortable with and AI reasoning about every single day. The second area is agent behavior. Once an agent is inside those data boundaries, what is it actually allowed to do? Which actions need a human to click approve and which ones can happen automatically? This is where your policy engine becomes vital. You aren't just writing static rules, you're writing policies that understand context. If an agent is managing your email, it might be fine for it to move messages into folders on its own, but that same agent shouldn't be allowed to delete an email without you saying so. If an agent is building a project plan, it can draft the proposal, but it shouldn't be able to assign tasks to your team until they've seen the plan first. Every policy is a line you draw between a suggestion and an action. The third area is memory. What is the system allowed to remember and for how long? Who gets to see that memory? If the system gets something wrong, how do you go in and fix it? These aren't just technical details. Memory is where the system gets its value, but it's also where the risk of surveillance is the highest. If you don't govern memory, the system becomes a permanent record of every mistake that can be used against someone later. You need clear rules for how long data is kept, and you need ways for users to see what's being remembered. You want a system that learns your preferences without keeping a permanent file on your behavior. The fourth area is accountability for outcomes. When an agent makes a move, who is responsible for the result? If an agent sends a customer to the wrong department, who owns that mistake? Is it the person who built the agent or the person the agent was working for? You need total clarity here because responsibility without a clear owner just leads to finger pointing. Every action an agent takes has a consequence, and that means every action needs a human owner. If something breaks, someone needs to be able to explain why it happened and how to fix it. These 4 areas work together as one single system. Access rules decide what the agents see. Behavior rules decide what they do. Memory rules decide what stays in the system. And accountability ensures that when things go wrong, there's a path to a solution. This isn't a set it and forget it configuration. Governance is a constant discipline. It's a function of how you run the company. You need people in specific roles to manage this. You need AI stewards who can help teams design agents that follow the rules. You need work designers who can figure out where an agent should be autonomous and where a human needs to step in. You need leaders who can adjust the policies as the company learns what works and what doesn't. The framework isn't there to slow you down. It exists to make the technology safe enough so that you can actually move fast. Without these rules, organizations get nervous and the whole project stalls out. The real power of Work IQ stays locked away because the company is too afraid to use it. But with the right structure in place, you can empower your teams to build and deploy agents with total confidence. But even the best governance won't matter if you don't know what you're trying to achieve. You have to know what you're measuring. Measuring intelligence, not activity. The moment you stop tracking emails sent and meetings attended, you have to answer a much harder question. What are you actually measuring instead? The old metrics at least had the virtue of being simple because you just counted things and watched the numbers go up. That looked like progress. But new metrics require Work IQ, and they ask about patterns that don't exist in activity logs. They exist in outcomes. Decision speed is a genuine operational metric, but it isn't about how fast people respond to messages. That's just more activity. Real decision speed means information enters the organization and a decision gets made, so you have to look at how long that cycle takes and where the information gets stuck. Work IQ can map this because it understands when information appears, when it's reviewed, and when the right people finally get involved to communicate a result. The system sees the entire flow rather than just individual actions. In most organizations, you simply can't measure this without Work IQ because you'd have to manually trace every detail through email, meetings, and documents. The system does it for you continuously. Cross-team collaboration quality is also measurable, but not in the way most leaders think. It's not about the volume of emails moving between departments. It's about whether that collaboration actually produces better results. You have to ask if a decision involving multiple teams had a lower rework rate or if it moved faster because the right expertise was involved early on. Work IQ sees the actual structure of these decisions. It knows which people were consulted and which ones actually influenced the final outcome. It can tell which collaborations were just for show and which ones changed the result, allowing you to measure the impact of teamwork directly. Context reuse is where Work IQ becomes essential because most organizations reconstruct context constantly. A person learns something in a meeting and writes it in an email, then someone else reads that email and has the same conversation with a third person. The same context gets explained over and over again. Work IQ measures whether information is actually flowing and being reused, or if the organization is locked in a cycle of repetitive explanation. If the same project context is being discussed in 8 separate meetings instead of being shared once, the system sees that waste and quantifies what better collaboration would look like. Outcome quality measures whether your decisions actually produce the results you intended. This sounds simple, but it's rarely measured at all. You make a big decision, but you don't track whether it had the effect you expected. Work IQ allows you to correlate those choices with everything that happens next. If a decision was made to focus on customer acquisition, did the team actually focus there or did they drift back to maintenance work? And when you shut down a product line, did those resources redeploy or did they just evaporate into other projects? These are measurable outcomes, but they require connecting a decision to what actually happens afterward. The critical point is that these metrics require continuous intelligence. You can't measure decision speed with a spreadsheet, and you certainly can't track context reuse by reading through old email threads. You can't assess the impact of collaboration from a survey. Work IQ makes these measurements automatic because the system is reasoning over work patterns every single day. It isn't creating new data. It's analyzing the data you already have in ways that expose metrics you never had visibility into before. The moment you commit to measuring intelligence instead of activity, you've made a choice about what the organization values. You're saying that you care whether decisions are fast, not whether people look busy. You care whether expertise is involved, not how many people sat in the meeting. You care whether context is being reused, not how many emails are being sent. You care whether decisions produce results, not how decisively you announce them. That commitment to measurement cascades through the entire organization. Leadership as orchestration. The traditional manager role emerged in a world where information was scarce and authority was strictly hierarchical. The manager was the gatekeeper. They were the person with access to information others didn't have and the decision authority others didn't possess. Managers controlled the flow of information because that was how you controlled the direction of the company. You released details strategically and made decisions carefully because you were the bottleneck by design. That was what management meant. The scarcity of information and the clarity of authority created a very specific role. Work IQ eliminates that scarcity, information flows continuously now, and patterns are visible to anyone with access to the system. Decisions are mapped and traceable. Authority becomes visible too, and I don't mean what the org chart says, but what the system observes about who actually influences outcomes. The gatekeeping function doesn't disappear, but it transforms into something entirely different. The new role is orchestration. It isn't about making every decision or guarding every gate. A manager in a work IQ environment needs to clarify which decisions humans should make and which ones agents should handle. This isn't a philosophical exercise, it's practical and operational. You have to decide if a choice requires human judgment because the context is new, or if an agent can propose options for a human to choose from. You might decide an agent can act autonomously within set boundaries, or that a specific issue must be escalated to leadership every time. This level of clarity doesn't exist in most organizations today. Most managers inherit a lot of ambiguity and operate according to informal understandings. Jane handles certain approvals, Tom makes staffing decisions, and Sarah decides what to say to the public. Nobody wrote this down or formalized it, it just evolved over time. Everyone who's been around long enough knows the pattern, while new people learn it slowly by doing things wrong and getting corrected. With agents, you can't operate on informal understanding. You have to make it explicit. If you don't, agents will operate on their best guess of what you want them to do. Their guess will sometimes be right, but other times it will be spectacularly wrong. Either way, you've trained people to expect decisions to happen without human involvement, and that changes your culture in ways you didn't anticipate. So managers have to design workflows explicitly. They have to decide which stages have agent proposals and which ones require human reviews or specific approvals. They have to figure out where agents can run in parallel and where they need sequential handoffs. This is workflow design, not traditional decision-making. It's a type of design most managers have never done because their workflows were always implicit and their decisions were ad hoc. Work IQ forces you to be deliberate. Managers also have to protect something that's increasingly at risk, which is focus time and psychological safety. As agents take on operational work, people naturally have more time, but organizations often fill that time with more work instead of allowing people to actually think. You get faster email triage just so you can attend more meetings. You get automatic task routing just so you can focus on more projects. Work IQ creates capacity, but cultural defaults tend to fill that capacity immediately. Managers have to actively protect that time and say a team isn't taking on another initiative because they need time to think. They have to create safety where people feel comfortable saying they can't add more, even when more becomes possible. They also have to think differently about productivity. It's not about how much people produce, but whether the work they're producing actually matters. You have to ask if decisions are moving outcomes forward or just creating more busy work. This requires a skill set most managers simply don't have yet. Most managers are optimized for getting people to complete tasks efficiently, not for asking whether the tasks are worth doing in the first place. Work IQ makes that question impossible to avoid because the system shows you which work produces outcomes and which is just noise. And it requires accountability for that judgment. You're not accountable for making sure people stay busy anymore. You're accountable for ensuring that effort translates into value. That's a different kind of pressure and a different kind of responsibility. It requires courage because it means admitting when work isn't producing results. It requires different relationships with your team because you're not commanding compliance. You're collaborating on which problems actually matter. This is a completely different skill set than traditional management. The organizational design shift. The way we structure organizations today reveals exactly how we think work should happen. Those assumptions are baked into every org chart, every reporting line, and every career path we create. Most companies organize themselves around roles, grouping people into sales teams, operations teams, or engineering departments. We group people by their function rather than what they are actually trying to accomplish. The structure tells us who owns the budget and who has the authority, and everything else in the business flows from that rigid setup. Work IQ collapses the idea that structure must follow function by showing us what actually drives outcomes. In reality, outcomes are driven by workflows like closing deals, onboarding customers, or solving service requests. These are not functions, but rather sequences of work that cut across every department in the building. Closing a deal requires sales expertise, but it also needs finance to approve terms, legal to review contracts, and operations to confirm delivery. Right now, that work flows across 4 different managers and 4 different budgets, and the coordination overhead required to keep them aligned is enormous. Work IQ makes it possible to organize around these workflows instead of departments. You could create a dynamic deal closure team where sales owns the relationship and legal owns the contract, but everyone operates as a single unit. They share the same visibility, the same metrics, and the same ownership over how fast the deal moves. Once the deal is done, people return to their functional homes without ever leaving their official roles. They simply add a temporary membership to a workflow team that actually owns the final result. This approach is far more agile than a traditional structure because you can staff workflows based on what is actually happening in the market. If you are suddenly onboarding a massive wave of customers, you move resources into that specific workflow immediately. Traditional structures do not flex that easily because headcount is locked into specific teams, and changing those lines takes months of politics. Workflow-centric organizing can adapt from week to week, which allows the business to breathe with the demands of its customers. But we have to acknowledge that this model is also more complex to govern. Authority becomes fluid when you have a functional manager in sales and a separate lead for the deal closure workflow. If those two people disagree on your priorities, you effectively have two bosses, which only works if the matrix is designed with extreme care. Most organizations fail at this, creating ambiguity and conflict instead of the clarity they were hoping to achieve. Span of control also changes in some very interesting ways. A typical sales manager might oversee 8 people directly, but if agents are handling the coordination and tracking approvals, that manager could oversee 30 people. The manager is no longer stuck manually routing deals or managing handoffs because the agents are handling the logistics. This allows the manager to focus entirely on coaching and strategic direction, which could dramatically flatten organizations and remove unnecessary management layers. However, this only works if decision rights are crystal clear, because if they stay ambiguous, adding agents just adds another layer of confusion. Most organizations will resist this shift fiercely because our current role-centric model creates very specific career paths. You progress up a ladder from salesman to director, and your authority and compensation are tied directly to that title. Workflow-centric organization breaks that ladder and replaces it with a portfolio of skills. You become known for your expertise in deal closure or technical implementation, moving between workflows as needed. Your career becomes broader and less linear, and your status is defined by the problems you can solve rather than how many people report to you. That redistribution of status threatens power structures that have been stable for decades. Organizations will say they are excited about this new way of working, but then they will spend 3 years doing absolutely nothing. They will deploy WorkIQ and see exactly which workflows matter, but then they will ignore the data because changing the structure feels too disruptive. The power stays exactly where it is, and this is why the next 18 months are so critical. The 2026 inflection point, June 16, 2026, is a date that carries a lot more weight than it might seem at first. That is the day Microsoft makes the WorkIQ APIs generally available to everyone. This is not a preview or a limited test, but a production-ready release that is backed by service-level agreements. It will be available to enterprises at scale, and that marks the moment when WorkIQ stops being an optional feature. It becomes the core infrastructure that every serious Microsoft 365 deployment will have to address. The consumption-based pricing through Copilot credits removes the friction that usually kills enterprise adoption. You do not need to negotiate a new contract or wait for a new budget cycle to start experimenting. The cost simply shows up on your existing bill, which means organizations can increase their usage without needing special approval. The entire business model is engineered to make "let's try it" much easier than saying no. This is the true inflection point for the industry. Before June of 2026, WorkIQ is just internal infrastructure that makes Copilot work a little better. After that date, it becomes a decision platform that developers can integrate with and customers can demand. Competitors who have already built their systems around this will operate much faster than those still trying to figure out a governance framework. But there is a question here that matters much more than the specific date. Before June 16th, companies could avoid the hard questions by saying they were taking a measured approach to AI. That language is no longer viable because the capability now exists, whether you are ready for it or not. Your competitors are building, and the people inside your own organization are already experimenting with agents that generate work that needs to be managed. The question is no longer whether you should use intelligent agents, but how you plan to govern them at scale. This has stopped being a technology problem and has become a question of organizational design. Those answers take a long time to get right, and early adopters are gaining a massive structural advantage. It is not because they have better tools, but because they have done the hard work of cleaning their data and defining their frameworks. These early movers will have 18 months of operational experience by the time everyone else is just getting started. They will have redesigned their workflows to use agents meaningfully, and they will have built new roles around how these agents actually operate. Their leaders will be thinking about orchestration instead of gatekeeping, and their measurement systems will focus on outcomes rather than just activity. They will have learned what fails in their specific context, which gives them a head start that is almost impossible to close. That advantage is structural and permanent. It is not about being first to market with a cool app, but about having redesigned your entire operating model. You gain clarity on decision authority and learn how agents actually change the nature of work instead of just making it faster. That learning gap will be measured in months of execution speed and years of superiority over those who started late. Late adopters face a very real and dangerous choice. You can choose to redesign now while you still have the luxury of time to learn, or you can wait until the pressure becomes unbearable. History suggests most companies will wait until they see what their competitors have done, and then they will panic. They will try to force adoption during a crisis without proper governance, which creates the kind of chaos that confirms everyone's worst fears about AI. The technology is not the bottleneck anymore because the APIs are sound and the architecture is solid. The only real constraint left is organizational readiness and whether you can actually change how you measure success. Can you grant decision authority to an agent and reorganize your teams fast enough to keep pace? Most organizations cannot do this, not because they lack talent, but because true transformation threatens the existing power structure. They will continue to deploy agents in small tactical ways and eventually wonder why they aren't seeing a return on their investment. But some organizations will be ready for this shift, and those are the ones that will pull away from the rest of the pack. The readiness assessment. If the next 18 months are going to matter, you have to answer one question first. Are you actually ready to use that time productively? I'm not asking if you're ready to buy a license or run a small pilot. I'm asking if you're ready to transform. Work IQ deployment is a mirror. It reveals exactly how prepared your organization is, and in reality, most companies will discover they aren't nearly as ready as they assumed. The assessment itself is straightforward. It covers 4 specific domains. You either have clarity in these areas or you don't. If you have it across all 4, you can move fast. If you have it in some but not others, you know exactly where to focus your energy first. And if you have clarity in none of them, then congratulations. You just identified your actual starting point. The first domain is data hygiene. I'm not talking about your high-level data strategy or your complex architecture. I'm talking about the actual condition of your SharePoint permissions right now. Can you honestly say who has access to what? You might assume people follow best practices, but when you actually audit the system, you find out they don't. You need to know which sites are active and which are dormant. You need to identify which teams are business critical and which are just abandoned projects that nobody bothered to archive. If your file naming conventions are a mess, nobody can understand what they're looking at. If your metadata tags are inconsistent, the whole purpose of tagging is defeated. This is the messy part of the job. You'll likely find thousands of archive teams taking up space in shared drives where half the company has access to sensitive contracts. The second domain is governance maturity. This isn't about your aspirations or the frameworks you plan to build next year. It's about whether you have clear, enforceable policies right now. You need to be able to articulate what an agent is allowed to do and, more importantly, what it isn't. When an agent produces an outcome that's different from what you expected, do you have a defined process for that? Most organizations discover they only have fragments of a plan. You might have a DLP policy over here and a retention schedule over there, but nothing is integrated. You have governance theater instead of a governance structure. If your rules don't cover agent autonomy or memory, you aren't ready. The third domain is leadership alignment. This question matters more than any other. Are your executives committed to redesigning how work gets done, or are they just hoping for a tool that makes the existing process faster? If leadership just wants faster email, that's exactly what you'll get. But you won't get transformation. You won't get the organizational redesign that actually delivers a real return on investment. You'll just end up with a faster version of the same broken system. Real alignment means leaders are willing to change how they measure success. They have to be willing to restructure around workflows and grant actual decision authority to agents. If they aren't ready to measure outcomes instead of just activity, Work IQ won't deliver any meaningful value. The fourth domain is outcome clarity. You have to define what winning looks like in terms of business impact. Don't talk to me about features deployed or pilots completed. Tell me if decision speed is going to drop from 30 days down to 5. Tell me if cross-team collaboration is going to produce better results in less time. When context is reused instead of reconstructed, you might save each person 2 hours every week. Projects should close 2 weeks faster and rework should drop because decisions are clearer from the start. These are measurable outcomes. If you can't articulate success in terms that matter to the business, you don't have a strategy. You just have hopes. Most organizations are going to fail this assessment. To be honest, you probably will too. You'll find gaps in all 4 domains. Your assumptions won't hold up under pressure. You'll realize your data is messier than you thought, and your leadership isn't actually aligned. Success will mean different things to different stakeholders, and your governance will look like a collection of scattered policies. But that isn't a failure, it's a diagnostic. It's the moment you discover exactly where you need to focus. Use this assessment to prioritize your next moves. Clean up the domain that is the most broken. Build governance in the space that matters most. Align your leadership on the outcomes that will actually unlock value. Every domain you strengthen makes the next one easier to tackle. The first 90 days. Readiness is a diagnostic tool, but it shouldn't be paralyzing. You don't have to solve every problem in all 4 domains before you can start. What you need to do is pick one single workflow and commit to learning everything you can from it. The first 90 days aren't about scaling work IQ across the entire enterprise. They are about building your capacity to learn before you try to go wide. Start with one high-value workflow. It doesn't have to be the biggest one you have. Pick the one where improvement actually matters and where the friction is easy to see. This could be project execution, sales deal closure, or customer onboarding. It might be HR hiring or finance approval chains. The specific department matters less than the characteristics of the work. You want a workflow that exists across multiple teams, where speed is a factor and where you can measure exactly where things are getting stuck right now. Once you have the workflow, map the current state. Don't map the ideal state or what the official org chart says. Map the reality. You need to find where decisions are actually made and where information is moving through hidden email chains instead of being centralized. Look for the spots where handoffs are manual when they should be automated. Find the people who are waiting for approvals from other departments. This is detective work. You are following information through real conversations and documents to see who actually influences the outcome. Most organizations operate on theory, but this mapping breaks that theory and shows you the truth. From that map, you can see where work IQ will actually reduce friction. Look at information retrieval. Can agents find the right context faster than a person hunting through old documents? Look at context synthesis. Can agents assemble everything needed for a decision in one place? Then look at decision routing. Can agents get that information to the right person without a human coordinator? These are your leverage points. These are the places where continuous intelligence actually changes the flow of work. You need to pilot this with a small, engaged team. Don't pick your most skeptical people, but don't pick the most naive ones either. Find a group that is tired of how slow things are and is actually willing to work differently. A group of 20 people is much better than 200. You aren't trying to measure adoption yet. You are trying to learn how this technology affects this specific way of working. Before you deploy a single thing, you have to establish your baseline metrics. I'm not talking about how many people log in. I'm talking about actual workflow numbers. Measure how long it takes from the moment information enters the workflow until a decision is made. Track the rework rate to see how many decisions have to be redone. Count how many times people have to rehash the same information in separate conversations. These numbers won't be perfect, but they are real. They are the baseline you will measure against 6 months from now. Now, deploy Work IQ to support that workflow. Don't try to automate the whole thing at once. Pick one critical stage or a single decision point. Maybe the agents handle the context assembly or the follow-up automation. It needs to be something tangible that people interact with every day. It should be something that either works or it doesn't. This generates the signals you need to understand what happens when intelligent systems touch your processes. You need to measure the results at 30, 60, and 90 days. If you wait until the end, you've waited too long. The 30-day mark shows you if the system is being used or if people are just working around it. That tells you if you have a user education problem. At 60 days, you can see if behavior is actually changing. People should be using agents instead of manual steps. By 90 days, you should see if the outcomes are changing. Is the cycle faster? Is the rework dropping? Is the team moving differently? Whatever you do, don't measure adoption. Adoption is a lagging indicator that only tells you if someone clicked a button. Outcome change is the only thing that matters. The decision cycle metric will tell you if speed increased, and the rework metric will tell you if quality improved. These are the only numbers that justify moving forward. Use these results to shape your next phase. If agents helped in one stage but confused people in another, you need to double down on what worked and redesign what didn't. If certain types of decisions improved while others stayed the same, that is your signal. It tells you where the intelligence layer actually changes behavior. If some people use the system while others ignored it, you'll know if you have an adoption problem or an alignment problem. Those first 90 days are your learning cycle. You aren't trying to transform the whole company in 3 months. You are building the organizational capacity to understand how this changes the nature of work. You are building the evidence that intelligent agents can improve outcomes. This is how you create a foundation for everything that comes next. Work IQ isn't just another productivity tool, because in reality, it's a complete structural overhaul of how your organization thinks. Moving from simple storage to active reasoning will fundamentally change your governance and your culture. Most companies will fight this shift because it exposes every hidden dysfunction in the system. But the advantage goes to the leaders who redesign their models around it right now. You need to start your data cleanup today, because that 2026 inflection point is coming much faster than you think.